Welcome to episode 33 of Military Veterans Podcast, where we talk to veterans to learn about their stories and experiences. And today we're joined by Steve Rindahl. Have I got that right?
Yeah, did a good job.
Good job. Okay, cool. How you doing today, Steve?
Doing well, thank you. Appreciate being on.
No problem. So we're doing another remote recording. So I'm in the UK, and Steve, whereabouts are you in this world?
Just outside of San Antonio, Texas.
San Antonio, Texas. Is it good weather at the moment?
It is. We got good sun today. It'll be 80 something degrees Fahrenheit. So nice warm day.
Nice. We had loads of torrential rain this morning, but the sun's now come out once I'm in my recording studio. So typical, right? But just want to say, Steve, thanks very much for coming on and being a guest. We do have the 4 questions as previous episodes. Right. So those are a summary of your time in the military, and then we'll get into the heart of the show. So for yourself, I'm going to do them as 2s. So the first 2 are, when did you join the military, and what service and branch did you join?
All right. I joined in May of 85, and I joined the U.S. Army Special Forces.
Nice. And I do believe you tweaked and changed things during your time. So
Yeah.
How'd that look?
Right. So after spending 9 years in the Special Forces, I got selected for recruiting duty, and which ultimately led to my choosing to find a career elsewhere. Got out of the Army, actually transferred into the reserve component, went through seminary, became ordained, and then applied to come back into the active duty Army for the sake of being an Army chaplain. So came back into the Army in the chaplain corps.
Nice. Well, it will be cool to hear what that journey's like for sure. And then the last 2 questions are, how long did you serve for in total with all of those different areas? And also, what rank did you get to?
Right. Okay, I served a grand total of 31 years. Of that, 23 of them were on active duty, and then the other 8 were in the reserve. And
Nice.
I ultimately retired as a chaplain major.
Okay. Well, let's rewind the clock. So, Steve, where was you born and where did you grow up?
Okay, yeah, I was born in Illinois, a little bit outside of Chicago, and which is the only thing most people know about the state is one city up in the corner. And I split my growing up time between Illinois, North Dakota, and Montana because my dad's side of the family is all from the cattle country. So North Dakota and the eastern side of Montana. And then I joined the Army when I was 17 and been bouncing around ever since.
Okay. So before you joined the Army, what was kind of growing up and education for yourself like? Was it pretty normal?
Yeah, the elementary school, the junior high and high school. And I didn't really like school, didn't enjoy it. I mean, I did fairly well, but it was boring to me and it was tedious to me. Did not want to go on to university. I didn't really grasp the idea that once you got to university, you could actually pick subjects that you liked instead of doing what other people told you to do. So that wasn't exciting to me. And I was always looking for a chance to get out and do something adventurous and exciting. So when I was 17, well, quite a bit earlier than being 17, but the earliest a person can enlist in the United States is 17. So when I turned 17, I joined the Army with 2 goals in mind, and that was to jump out of planes and go to war. And a couple months later, I was jumping out of planes, and 20-something years later, I went to war.
Okay. So did you have like history of military within the family, or was there something else that kind of enticed you to join up at that young age?
My dad served in the Army for 2 years, but that was only because we had a draft at the time. There wasn't it wasn't because he had chose to do so. And other than that, no, there's not any significant military history I mean, if you trace the family tree far enough, you find service here or there, but that's not a big tradition within the family. Uh, don't know really what first caught my attention, but it was probably watching old reruns of the all the good propaganda stuff that was put out after the end of the Second World War. So
I see.
just looked exciting. It was some something to do that was adventurous.
Okay. Was you quite an adventurous child then? Did you enjoy
I
sports or go out hunting or something? I don't know.
I tried to be an adventurous child. My mom was a little bit on the protective side, so I didn't get out to as nearly as many adventures as I wanted to. But that was always my goal, to be going out and doing something. So
Okay.
shooting sports primarily.
And so when you did join up, you mentioned you had to wait till you were 17.
Correct.
And then did you go down to like a recruiting office or how did it work back then?
Yeah, walked into a recruiting office when I was 16, and because you could take all the tests that were required at 16, you just couldn't actually sign a contract until you're 17. So I was
Okay.
16. I walked into the recruiting office. I said, I want to join, and they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to jump out of planes. And they said, well, you have to actually pick a job. I said, I don't care what job I have. I just want to jump out of planes. And they said, okay, let's get this straight. If we can guarantee you that you will jump out of planes, you will join. Said, absolutely. So went down, took the test, scored well, passed the physical, and waited for my 17th birthday. Went in, sat down, and the guidance counselor, as they're called, said, okay, pick a job. I said, I want the job that comes with jumping out of planes. And there's, they have to, within our system, I don't know how enlistment works there, but within our system, they're supplying the entire Army through one central location.
Okay.
So the person who actually writes the contracts knows how many positions are available in all these different places. And so he pulls up on the computer, he goes, there's no place for you to go with the airborne option right now. So just pick a job and go to airborne school later. And I was like, no, the only thing that I really know about enlisting is I want it in my contract. And I know this can be in my contract, talked about it with the recruiter. And so if airborne school is not in my contract, I'm not going. And so he told me to go sit somewhere else. And I thought he was calling the recruiter to come pick me up and pull me off the floor. And what he was really doing, I learned later when I got stuck on recruiting duty, is he was calling what's called the Recruiting Operations Center, or they call it the ROC, and trying to get an additional airborne slot loaded into the computer so that they can enlist me into it.
All right.
And so I sat there for hours. And finally he says, okay, come here. He says, I got a job for you. And I said, does it come with jumping out of planes? He goes, yes, it comes with jumping. That's the whole point. He was pretty frustrated at the time. So I signed my contract, and that was in May, and left for training a couple weeks later. Went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is the home of the artillery here. So I went and did my basic, what we call basic combat training with a bunch of artillerymen. And I went to airborne school because you have to be jump qualified to be a parachute rigger, because the job that I got that came with jumping out of planes was to be a parachute rigger. And went to parachute rigger school, and first went to airborne school, graduated that, went on to parachute rigger school, and reported to my duty assignment, which was the 12 Special Forces Group.
Okay. Okay. So you mentioned earlier about you're not sure where the kind of like enticement from joining the army was from, and having that specific kind of like wish of jumping out of planes. There has to have been something. Like you mentioned about potential movies or something, but there has to have been something.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to join the Army when I was really young, but that was just it. It was just the Army. And it just continued to get refined as I got older. because once I actually decided, you know, uh, I'd gotten to that point where it's like, okay, this really is what I'm going to do. Well, if this is what I'm going to do, what do I want to do when I'm in? And as I looked at the different options, the one that looked the most exciting was to jump out of planes. So
Okay.
again, it was just it was looking for excitement. That's the bottom line.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So with your research, that's what's helped you. And
Yeah.
then you mentioned about the three. It sounded like three different areas of training. Because I'm guessing you go to like basic or boot camp, right, to bring
Right.
you from being a civilian to become a military person. And then you mentioned about jump school. Did I get that right?
Right. Yep.
And then the rigor aspect. So those three areas are probably pretty large and involved and intense in themselves. So just starting off with like basic, how did you find that? Because you'd been a civilian for 16 years, 17 years,
Right.
and then they kind of like want to whittle you down. So how did you find becoming a soldier?
Yeah. For me, basic training was really challenging, honestly. Um, Primarily because I never was a real. I mean, I had an adventure, a desire for adventure, but I was never a significant athlete. And so I am tall, got long legs. You know, the doing the road march, or I think you call it tabbing. Like
Yes.
put the ruck on and march. Yeah, that part was easy. I could carry the weight, and I can walk fast. That part was easy. But the running, the chin ups, the all of the other physical activity, that was a bigger challenge for me. But yeah, basic training at the time was 8 weeks. I do believe it's been extended to 9 or 10 weeks now. With Because being in the Army is more technical than it was, right? So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's but at the time it was just basic soldier skills, being physically fit, knowing how to shoot, knowing how to do first aid at a on the spot lifesaver level, and marching and doing land navigation. So
Okay.
the tasks themselves I adapted to pretty quickly, but going from a pretty lightweight life as far as physical activity, jumping into the basic training was was a pretty big swing for me. So yeah, it was great. I was successful, but yeah, that was the biggest challenge for me moving into the Army.
And
And then
whereabouts did you do that one?
that was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma,
Okay.
and
Right.
so it's I can't they they flew us in, got us on location, and then we left again. So I can't even tell you where in the state it is because it's the only time I've ever been there.
Fair enough.
But I was I got to tell you it was kind of funny looking back at it. I laugh, but uh, like I said, flew us in, got there late at night. They shovel us onto buses. They get us there. Probably, I'm sure they do something similar. Lots of yelling and screaming and jostling you around, keep you disoriented. We get to we get on post. We're getting out. We're in what's called reception station, where they're going to do all of our paperwork, issue our uniforms, shave our heads, all that. And that constant keep us guessing, keep us moving. Absolutely miserable. Starting to wonder if I'd made the right choice. And what I heard was artillery going off because it's artillery training base. But I'd never heard artillery before. So I'm like, great. I'm miserable. I don't know if I did the right thing. And now it's going to rain on me because I thought it was thunder.
Oh, brilliant. So it's
So
crazy, isn't it?
it was crazy. One of the little facts of Fort Sill, though, is that's where the great Apache chief Geronimo ended his life. When he surrendered to the U.S. Cavalry, he went and lived on Fort Sill until his death. So
Right.
that's kind of one of the. It's not a secret or anything, but not a lot of people know that. It's just neat little aspect of the history of Fort Sill.
Okay. Okay.
And then I went to Fort.
And
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
go for it. I
I
was
was
going to
just
say,
going to
yeah.
say,
And then you moved on to the next bit there.
yeah, from there you go to Fort Benning, Georgia, and went there for Airborne School. Got what was, again, when I was looking back at it, probably a good thing. I felt like I got a raw deal when I got there. If you arrive before midnight, you start class on Monday, start training on Monday. If you arrive after midnight on Friday, um, then you have to wait an entire week and start in the following. So you have what's called 0 week. And
Right.
so our, again, graduate, put you on a bus, bring you out to the airport, fly you in, put you on a bus, bring you out to the training location. And sure enough, we arrive at 0015 or something. It's like, y'all got 0 week.
No.
But it was actually pretty good because it gave me, at least, it gave me the opportunity to kind of get myself situated, kind of shake off that basic training environment where everything's extremely regimented, and realize that from that point on, they were going to treat us like soldiers because we'd graduated from basic training. And so, I mean, we did a lot of stupid details to keep us busy. If you've ever been out on a drop zone before, it's just this great big huge expanse of land, and where they're going to jump into. And to keep us busy during 0 week, one of the days or 2 of the days, went out there and with just regular push lawnmowers started mowing the drop zone. And so I asked the instructors are called black hats. I asked the black hat, I was like, Sergeant Airborne, you don't expect us to actually finish this, do you? And they're like, oh no, the last jump is on Thursday, and a farmer will come in and mow it for hay on Friday. I was like, oh, that's an Army detail for you.
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
It only has one purpose in life: to keep people busy.
Keep busy, right? And then I'm guessing the physical aspect of Airborne School is another level above
Yeah,
typical basic. So how did you find that? Another level.
yeah, that was really demanding as well in one area, really one area only, and that's the speed of the running. Like I said, I wasn't a big runner. Still, never became a good runner. I got up to the level of survival level running. Right? How fast do I have to go? Okay, I'll train until I get that fast. It just hurts too much to run. But Airborne School is running 5 miles a day. I don't know what the pace is. It seemed extremely fast to me. Some people find it slow, but they're good runners, I guess. But we ran in the first week. It was still hot. I was there in October, and it was still hot the first week. And I don't think they've got these set up anymore. But at the time, they had these areas that we would run through every, I don't know, half mile or so. And they just had these big downpour rain shower heads. And so the entire formation would run under this pouring water to cool you off while you were running, because you weren't going to stop because of the heat. You can't stop training. Now they do stop training for heat. So I don't know if that's still if they still have that shower system set up for while you're running or not. But yeah, it was just, you run every morning, and then after that, the rest of the day was demanding because you were constantly in motion. You got to learn how to land, which means you're jumping off platforms all day, and you
Right.
climb up a platform, jump off the platform, climb up the platform, jump off the platform, so on and so forth. You had to learn how to actually steer the canopy as much as they can be steered. So you're in a training device called the oh shoot. Well, it's called the Nutcracker is what it's called. I can't think of what it's called for real. Suspended harness training. That's what it's called, suspended harness training. And so you put a parachute harness in, and then they use a pulley to pull you up so your feet are off the ground. And then as you pull the risers, it causes the harness to shift. So you know what it's like to have to pull against your body weight to either drift left or drift right, depending on what the wind conditions are. But as I told you from the nickname, you can probably guess that the more time you spent in the suspended harness, it's just growing agony over the course of that. So all that's in what's called ground week. And then you move into tower week, and tower week was this training device called 34-foot tower. Somebody figured out, whether it's true or not, what they told us, that people who have a fear of heights, if they can make it past 30 feet, then it doesn't matter how high. You know, it's somewhere between that 0 and 30 feet range that's going to cause them to stop. And so they built these 34-foot towers. And again, you put on a harness. It doesn't have a parachute attached to it. Instead, it's the risers are attached to a cable system. So you jump off of the tower as if you were jumping out the door of an aircraft, and then you just run down this cable system. And there's a big earth berm at the far end, and when you approach it, you just kind of drag your feet across that, and there's a couple people that'll try to catch you and slow you down and disconnect you, and you run up there and do it again. So again, it's constantly running through all of those different training activities. None of it's particularly hard by itself, but it makes for an exhausting day.
Yeah, it does sound it.
And then jump week. Jump week's the gravy, right? That's what you're there for. So Monday you jump once. Again, they'll adjust it. You know, if they've got bad weather coming in or something, they'll compress it based on weather reports. But my schedule and the standard schedule at the time was you jump once on Monday, you jump twice on. You jump once on Monday, once on Tuesday, twice on Wednesday, and twice on Thursday. And then, like I said, they can shift all that to left if they need to earlier in the week, or if you had bad weather on the front end, they can shift it to later in the week. But the key is you got to get 5 jumps in during jump week. And assuming you get your 5 jumps in and you don't break anything in the process, then you graduate. And if you're anybody else, any other job has already been trained in what their job is. So like an airborne infantryman will go to basic training, and then the additional training required for them to be a fully qualified infantryman, and then airborne school. You're going to be an airborne artilleryman, same thing. You're going to go to basic training, the artillery course, and then airborne school. But because a parachute rigger has to be airborne qualified to be a parachute rigger, you go basic training, airborne school, and then parachute rigger school.
Okay.
So graduate. Everybody else is going on to their duty assignments. They're going to go be full-time soldiers somewhere. And myself and whoever else was there for rigger school, they scoop us up in a bus and they run us off to Fort Lee, Virginia. And get to Fort Lee.
But before you get into that, I have a question for you. So you had this like mindset of joining the army, but you want to be jumping out of planes. You then do jump week and therefore do your 5-6 jumps. How was it for you jumping out of the plane for that first time and maybe living that dream that you so badly wanted?
Okay, so they showed us how the parachute worked one day, but honestly, either I wasn't paying very close attention or I didn't understand what they were saying, one or the other. Because what they do is they take, it's called the static line. It's the cable that runs you. It's not actually a cable, it's a nylon webbing. But anyway, they attach that to an anchor point, and then you got one instructor who's wearing the harness, and he starts walking as the other instructor is explaining. So they put the static line on an anchor point. The instructor that's doing the demonstration simulates a jump out the door, and then he starts walking away from the anchor point. And they're like, okay, now you're going to get to the end of this 15 feet. At the end of the 15 feet, your body weight's going to break the pack closing loop. And so he takes a knife and he pops the pack tray closing loop. At that point, you continue to walk away, and the big bag that's got the parachute in it, the deployment bag, it drops out, and the suspension lines start coming loose, right? All that paracord that's going to go up to the canopy, and it hits the end. This is now your bag closing loops will break. There's a bag closing loop on either side of the deployment bag. So he pops that with the knife. And he continues to walk. Now the parachute starts coming out. And he gets to so now he's got 30 feet of suspension line, another 16 feet of radius of the canopy. And at this point, you're only 2 seconds in to your jump at this point. And he says, now at this point, the apex tie will break based on your body weight. And he cuts that tie. Canopy opens. You've got the canopy, the static line, and the deployment bag stay attached to the aircraft. I missed that last part completely. I was only paying attention to the canopy. So we're in the aircraft. First, it was a C-141, which is beautiful. They're no longer in the inventory, at least not in the US, but it was a great aircraft to jump from. And everything's going really well. Of course, everybody's pretty keyed up, pretty excited. And the first stick goes out. First 10 guys go out. Well, again, like I said, I wasn't paying any attention to the fact that the static line and deployment bag stays with the aircraft. So the jump master and the safety, they grab all the static lines and they start dragging them into the aircraft. Okay, well, we can see the static lines out the door, so that makes sense. But when they pulled everything in and you see the deployment bags, all I saw was this massive wad of green fabric. And I thought somebody's parachute had been pulled completely off of his back.
Oh, no.
So I was like, that guy, somebody went down without a parachute. And I'm trying to get people's attention around me, and they're looking at me like I'm an idiot, which I was. I hadn't paid any attention. And it was our stick's turn. So got up and hooked up and went to the door and jumped out, going, just be ready to pull your reserve in case that happens to me. And it wasn't until going up on the next jump that I realized what I had seen and how wrong I was. But yeah, I was absolutely terrified.
Right. He was terrified.
So, and then graduation, 5 jumps later, graduation, we graduated on the drop zone then. They've got a real beautiful graduation ceremony area now that didn't exist back then. And so we graduated directly on the drop zone. And they gave, at the time, it's no longer authorized. If you get caught doing it, you're subject to penalty. But they gave blood wings. And so the wings just get barely pushed through your shirt and then to sink them into your chest. So the idea, is that they're a permanent part of you. So you end up, puncturing the skin on your chest. It's uncomfortable. It's not a horrible thing. I don't know why they got rid of it, but I'm sure somebody complained. But but it was to get there, knowing that you've done it, knowing you've done it as a non-athlete. Like I said, I struggled every day in the run, just really sucking air, trying to keep up and not being able to catch any wind. To have made that and accomplished it, and then to me, the sting of having those wings applied, that was the greatest. That was better than any graduation I've ever been to, and I've been to a lot of graduations since then.
That's good. That's good. And then you mentioned about going to riggers.
Yeah, the parachute riggers
school
course.
Or
yeah.
Okay, it's a course, right? And so what is that? Because you'd have to explain that for me, but also maybe a few people listening that's not too sure what riggers do or are.
Right. Yeah. So what a parachute rigger does is basically anything that a parachute touches, a rigger is responsible for. So you go in, you learn how to pack personnel parachutes, you learn how to pack reserve parachutes, you learn how to pack the free fall parachutes for the guys that are jumping halo, the high altitude, low opening jumps. You learn how to sling load equipment and to and so which is exactly what it sounds like. You're loading things by sling underneath the bottom of a helicopter. Uh, and it's closely related because it's basically the same process except for a parachute. You prepare cargo loads for airdrop. So how do you level the load weight wise? What size canopy? Everything from small 100-pound resupply bundles, dropping rations, dropping ammunition, all the way up to learning how to drop major pieces of equipment and the different ways you can do it. Then how to repair all that equipment, to inspect it, make sure it's still airworthy, and make any necessary repairs that are required. And the Army runs its own course. It's the only course in the U.S. military. So our Navy personnel, Air Force personnel, Marine Corps personnel, they all come to the Army course. We host multiple allied nations that don't have their own rigger course. They'll come to the United States. And so it's a well-respected, well-designed school. It lasts for 13 weeks. And the Federal Aviation Administration, the people in the United States who are responsible for anything that happens in the air, they recognize the course. And so you graduate from the Army's parachute rigger course, and you go to the FAA, you can apply for a civilian license and pack for skydivers and stuff like that. The test your metal event that happens in rigger school is the first personnel parachute that you pack. Then you have to tag that and you'll jump it the next week. So the first thing you do is learn how to pack personnel parachutes. And then after you've done that, you've packed them a few times, you've broke them down, you're just packing strictly for the sake of training. You'll pack one and the instructor will come and it's like, okay, now tag that when you're going to jump that next week. And at that point, you really ought to be confident. You've just been doing it over and over. But there's always that yeah, but type in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
So then once you get that done, though, you're golden. It's an enjoyable job in most settings. There are places where it turns into kind of factory work because they just jump so much. You're just constantly basically working on a production line, and that's the way it feels. But the job itself, I always enjoyed it. I loved it, actually. I had the benefit of doing the job in a special forces environment. So unlike the 82nd Airborne Division, that's just jumping mass numbers of people, we had a pack mission that was more easily achievable on any given day. And we had more variety in what we were doing because we had those guys that were jumping halo. We had small resupply bundles for teams in the field and things like that. So I loved it. I had a great time doing that job, and it was painful when I got picked up on recruiting duty, and that was the end. I was like,
okay,
recruiting.
Well, before we jump into that, and it's still an important part to the military, right? So it may not be as fun as being part of your main career, let's say, but it's still a crucial part to the big cog, the machine of the cog of the machine. There we go. So again, just to get my head around this, just to make sure I'm on the correct page, people go through the rigger school, and then do you get assigned to a certain unit, station, and then you're in charge of their kind of rigs? Is that essentially it?
Yeah. So you graduate the course, and then again, going all the way back to the day that you signed your contract, you may know exactly where you're going. before you ever even start basic training, or you may be up to what's called needs of the Army. And so I knew I was going to special forces. There's a
Right.
few other people who did. A few other people that knew they were going to special forces. A couple of people knew they were going to the 82nd. Uh, but you can go to the 82nd Airborne Division. You can go to the, or at least at the time, you can go to the 101st. You can go to 173rd Airborne Brigade in Italy. You can go to any of the three Ranger regiments, excuse me, three Ranger battalions within the Ranger regiment. You can go to the airborne engineers that are on Fort Bragg. So there's quite a few places that you can go. But once you get there, then your responsibility is to ensure all airborne operations are fully covered by the needed number of parachutes, whether it's personnel, the main, the reserve, any airdrop equipment that's required is airworthy, properly rigged, and everything before it goes out is inspected by a rigger. And then on every airborne operation, there has to be a rigger present for the sake of basically quality control. So, and that hit the job title at the time is malfunction NCO, which I think is kind of, it ought to be the anti-malfunction NCO.
Yeah.
You're making sure malfunction doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're there to, if anything was to go wrong, to investigate the problem, annotate, all the equipment defects that you might find in the process of the investigation. But the kind of side benefit, if you're willing to be a malfunction NCO, which means you're going out and you're doing a lot of training that you wouldn't have to do if you're just no, I'm just going to pack, is that you're on that jump. So I always volunteered to be a malfunction NCO. The moment I was eligible, I was like, yep, I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it. And
Right.
as a result, I got a lot of jumps in really early. And for that reason, I was allowed to go to Jump Master School. I was allowed to go to the Air Assault course and the Rough Terrain Parachutist course. I got the opportunity to jump with some of our allied nations, and ultimately ended up being master rated as a parachutist.
Nice. Nice. So it sounds like, yeah, a lot of jumps, a lot of experience. And you mentioned about being part of special forces.
Right.
My understanding is it's slightly different in America than it is in the UK, because our special forces is essentially a branch, and then really we've got the SAS and SBS. We have SRR as well, but they're the two, I guess, most known areas of the special forces.
Right.
But I think it's slightly different over in the States. Is that correct? So when you say special forces, what area are you meaning?
Okay. Yeah. So in the US, anybody that falls under the bigger umbrella of special operations are called SOF, Special Operation Forces. So that includes U.S. Army Special Forces, U.S. Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Air Pararescue, the Marine Force Recon, and actually they don't call it Force Recon anymore. They call it MARSOC, so Marine Special Operations Command. So that is all under the larger umbrella of SOF. So then U.S. Army Special Forces is specifically the Green Berets.
Right. Okay.
All right. So there's 4 primary specialties within Special Forces as far as the team members are concerned. And these are they get all the attention because they do the work, right? So they deserve it. But the team members are the weapons specialists, the engineer / demolition guy, the communications guy, and the medic. As a minimum, you're going to be in training from start to finish. If you were to enter Special Forces from the street with the intention of being a team member, with the basic training, with the whichever lesser school is going to feed into your specialty. So infantryman, engineer, communications, medical. So basic training, your initial training in the specialty Airborne School and then the Special Forces course, you're going to spend close to a year in training as a minimum, and it could be well over a year at like your weapons guy that's going to be an infantryman. It's going to take him close to a year from the day one until he actually dons his green beret. The medical guy from day one to when he dons his green beret, it's going to be well over a year. And that's okay, I'm qualified to be on a team. But from there, they go on to language school. They do cultural immersions, things like that. So really, you're looking from day one until training is completed, closing in on 2 years
Mm.
for the team member. I was not a team member. Uh, they're amazing, amazing soldiers. I was on the support staff as a parachute rigger, but the assignment was amazing. I loved it.
Okay. So did you go away with them, or was you mainly? I mean, I know you mentioned about going around the world, but I don't know when that comes into play.
Right.
So with the unit you were with, are you allowed to mention where that was as well?
Yeah. So we were scattered about, but to try to give you the easiest answer is that time period, because like I said at the beginning, I joined in 85. So that first 9 years was still a lot of great Reagan, Bush, Cold War years. Um, so there weren't deployments as there is, now that we've got active conflict all over the world. But we would do, we were anticipating, of course, we're all geared up trying to figure out how to beat the Russians, right? And so we would do various forms of training that would be applicable to areas that were held by the former Soviet Union. And again, as mentioned a little while ago, as the person who was constantly volunteering to be the malfunction NCO, I had a I had a great opportunity. Couldn't do actual team member things, but all right, well, we're going to do this exercise in this location. And one example is Camp Ripley, Minnesota is way up by the Canadian border. So we jumped in there one time to do winter training. How are you going to, if we had to jump into the Russian tundra, do we know how to ski? Do we know how to snowshoe? Do we know how to use the Onkyo sleds? Do we know how to use snowmobiles? All of this kind of stuff. Well, we jump in, nobody had a malfunction. Technically, my job is over. Technically, right?
Right.
Fortunately, I had decent rapport with the team members. Got to support the same teams in these type of activities a few different times. So managed to build a little rapport there. And I was like, all right, here, learn how to do this, learn how to do that. And so just I got some good peripheral exposure that I wouldn't have gotten had I stayed back in the pack shed and just pack shoots and nothing else. And I got a better understanding of what the overall mission was. Like I said, we were tagged to jump into some Soviet held really rough terrain area, which is why I mentioned one of the schools I went to, rough terrain parachutist course. And that's up in the mountains of Montana. And so one of the guys I had good rapport with, I asked him, I was like, so what's this for? We're intentionally crashing into trees. Paratroopers try to avoid trees, and we're intentionally crashing into trees with this Kevlar bodysuit and motorcycle helmet with a metal face cage. And he's like, well, the area we're going to jump into looks kind of like this. He goes, so this is part of the infill plan. I was like, oh, okay. And he goes, important thing to know about this. And I'm like, yeah, what's that? Now I'm young. I'm still a young soldier. And he goes, there is no exfil plan.
Oh, really?
So I mean, Cold War planning was like worst case scenario stuff. So it was very different than what we've experienced in our current conflict and its asymmetrical nature.
Yeah, yeah. And then you did mention earlier about being put over to recruiting.
Right. Yeah.
So before you do mention that, because what year was that? What year did you get put into the recruiting?
Yeah. I got picked up on recruiting duty in 94.
94. Okay, so it was nine years in. You then
Right.
go and do the recruiting aspect. So during those 9 years, as you mentioned, it's not quite the same as what it is that people are aware of in the 2000s with deployments, Iraq, Afghanistan.
Right.
Is there any periods of experiences, stories that you want to pull out from those 9 years and just share with us what it was like in the late 80s, early 90s? Because just one thing on the early 90s, I know that the Iraq War, Iraq 1, Gulf 1, I'm not too sure how much the Americans were involved, if at all, but we were over there as the Brits. So, yeah, over to you with what you want to share.
Yeah. No, we were definitely there. It was interesting because that was heavily a tank war, right? And I remember getting briefed on that the people, each country has a different philosophy of what kind of tank to have, and the British like big heavy tanks, and the US it's kind of a split between heavy armor and speed, and some of the other European countries they're willing to sacrifice armor in order to go fast. And so when you would have these big sweeping motions across the desert combined between the multinational force, the the British were the pivot point because the speed of the tank was so much slower, but it could sit still and just take round after round after round if necessary. Where some of our European colleagues take a round and they're done. So they just have to go as fast as possible. So you put them way at the far end of the arc where they're moving really fast. But yeah, we were there. Uh, so that's 90, end of 90, first part of 91, I think, Gulf one.
Yeah.
And so the, so now it's a couple years later, got picked up on recruiting duty. There's still some, uh, that war was quick, fast, successful, you know, extremely minimal, if any, losses, depending on which force is being described. And so we had a little bit of residual positive energy from that, but not much because, I mean, we're looking at enlisting 17, 18, 19-year-olds, which means they were at the most 15. So they might remember a little bit, or they were 13 and, they were just, jumping their bikes off of ramps and trying to do stunts in the yard. They weren't paying attention to the news. 90, at that point, it was the kind of early on in the Clinton administration. And there was a pretty decent economy uptick at that time. So people join the Army for a lot of different reasons. One of them is to get a job when you can't find a job anywhere else. So that particular element of our recruiting pool was eliminated because there was plenty of jobs available. And so we needed to find people who were just patriots, people who were craving some adventure, people who wanted some kind of skilled training that they couldn't afford to go to school for. So people who wanted to be a mechanic, people who wanted to be in some kind of trades that we've got in our different civil engineers and construction folks, people who wanted to get their foot in the door in the medical field, stuff like that. Well, those jobs, because they are skilled labor, come with higher enlistment standards. And so it was a strange dynamic. We had a fairly decent propensity to join as far as people wanting to, but between having higher test scores required for the jobs that were available, the jobs that people wanted, the reality of drug usage, people can't get in. They got really, it's if you've used anything in the last 30 days, because you have to have a clean urinalysis. And
Yeah.
so, if a kid can't stay off dope for 30 days, he can't join the Army, right? And
Yeah.
it's a, I'll tell you what, for a recruiter, it's a horrible day. It's like, you smoke dope? No, okay. You go and you test them, they physical, they join. A couple days later, the drug test comes back and they pissed hot or whatever. And you get the call. It's like, okay, this guy's getting dropped. Yeah, I got to replace him. And you call the kid in. It's like, well, you said you didn't use drugs. He's like, oh, just on the weekends. That doesn't count. So you quickly learn to ask, when was the last time you used drugs instead of do you use drugs?
Yeah, fair.
To get it to get a better answer. And so with that, and then the problem with criminal activity. I mean, most of it is just juveniles being stupid, but you got a conviction record, you're not getting into the Army. And then the fact that we've got a height and weight standard. It's not a super strenuous physical requirement just to show up on the first day, but we are an ever more growingly obese nation. And, the Department of Defense here has done multiple studies over the last year as to why we didn't make our recruiting mission this year. This year, the Army missed recruiting mission massively, didn't even come close to making the minimum number required to sustain the force. And so they're studying what's the problem. It's only a little bit less than 5% of what would technically be eligible population as far as age is concerned. It's a little less than 5% that actually can get in. They're either overweight, they've got convictions, they've got recent drug usage, they can't pass the test, and the test isn't a giveaway, but it's not rocket science either, right? So, but you take all of these different elements, put them together, and it's a really small pool that the recruiters are currently trying to pull from in order to keep the force sustained. So we had challenges when I was on recruiting duty, but they don't even come close to the challenges they're facing now. I really have a kind of a sense of pity on the people who are currently recruiting, because I hated it. It was hard, and it's only harder now. So I can't imagine what they're living through.
Yeah, especially this time, right? Excuse me, that we're like coming out of we are out of Afghanistan and Iraq, and that was what was driving it for the last 20 years. So it can only be more difficult. So in regards to you being the recruiting team, how long was you doing that job?
Yeah, that's what really drove me off of active duty, because when I got picked up on recruiting duty, I was like, okay, recruiting is a 3-year assignment. I can grit my teeth, right, and I can do my 3 years and then go back and I'm happy. Well, I don't consider myself to have been an especially good recruiter, but I was fairly successful. And recruiting was at a hard spot compared to other times in the Army's history. And so they were extending people. They were just saying, okay, well, you're going to do 4 years, or you're going to do 4.5 years in order to have more recruiters in the field. The theory was more people would be contacted, more people contacted, more people enlist. And so I got extended. And I was like, oh, this is a bad deal. Like, I was willing to take one for the team and do 3 years, but to do another year and a half, that's just unreasonable. So I started looking for ways to get reassigned outside of recruiting, and calling everybody I knew. Then what happened is there are people who actually like recruiting, they enjoy recruiting, they're successful at it, it fits their personality, and they can request to recruit for the entire rest of their career. And they've become, and they're called career recruiters. And so one day I went in and I had a set of orders waiting on me. They said that I had been converted to a career recruiter.
Oh, right.
I was like, well, wait a minute. I didn't ask for this. I'm like, oh, but it's okay. This is the right thing for you. Like all this, I'm like, you know, what backroom drug deal got done that sucked me into this mess? And so then I just upped my request. Like, it's a 4187 request for personnel action. Turned to 4187, I think, every single month, requesting assignment outside of recruiting duty. And I had, right before I got picked up on recruiting, I had re-enlisted. So I re-enlisted for 6 years because I knew I wanted to be a career soldier. So 6-year enlistment was an option. So I did a 6-year re-enlistment. And I ended up being on recruiting for all but the first couple weeks of that 6 years.
Really? Wow.
And so when my re-enlistment window came open, if you're going to re-enlist, you have to re-enlist within a certain time frame leading up to, so that everything can get processed. You don't just drop off. You can't re-enlist on the last day, whatever. So you enter your re-enlistment window and then you exit your re-enlistment window. So when my re-enlistment window opened up, the sergeant major came in and he says, "Okay, when are you going to re-enlist?" I said, "I'm not." And he goes, "Well, what would it take to get you to re-enlist?" I said, "Send me back to being a parachute rigger." "That's not going to happen." And he leaves.
Really?
Like, all right.
What?
I said, "Okay." So I come back and he comes back the next day. "What's it going to take to get you to re-enlist?" I said, "Put me back being a parachute rigger." "No." "Okay. Any shortage MOS, military occupational specialty, any job out there that's currently shortage, I'll take outside of recruiting duty." Not going to happen. So he comes in again the next day. He goes, "We'll give you any recruiting station that you want in the battalion." "No." Comes back, "We'll give you any recruiting station that you want in the brigade." "No." "We'll give you any recruiting station you want in the country." "No." "Give you any recruiting station you want in the world," because the U.S. forces have so many soldiers overseas between Britain and Germany and Spain and Korea and Japan. We've got recruiting stations where there are military dependents, As you go anywhere in the world? "No. All I want is to be out of recruiting duty." And that's not going to happen. So we basically just stared at each other the entire time my re-enlistment window was open. And the day it closed, he's like, "All right, well, you're getting out then." And a few months after that, I processed out, went from active duty into the reserve. Didn't really know what I was going to do at that point. And it took a lot of soul searching and looking around while I was on recruiting duty. In the little bit of time I had available to myself, I had re-engaged church life, which I had done as a child, but hadn't done since, with any significance anyway. And ultimately, through that experience of returning to the church, realized that there was a lot of value to be had, a lot of personal satisfaction to be had, that I felt like I would be doing something worthwhile to be in some form of ministry, but I didn't know what it was, because I knew I didn't want to be in a local parish and arguing over carpet color and stupid things like that. And so I had this sense of a call to ministry, but didn't know how to act on it. And then I was, a few months later, I'm sitting here trying to figure out how to follow up on this idea of being involved in ministry without being in the parish. And I met a police chaplain, the local police department. And I thought to myself, well, that'd be a pretty good form of ministry. I like that idea. I don't know anything about the police department, though. I guess that's done. And it was probably 2 weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night, sat up, and was like, I know a lot about the Army. We've got 5 chaplain recruiters in the United States, and one of them happened to be close to where I lived. So I went in. I didn't know anything about becoming a chaplain. I'd been on recruiting for the previous 6 years, minus a couple months. And I went in and I told him, I said, I want to be a chaplain. He goes, okay, where'd you go to seminary? I don't know what that is. He's, he's like, what church are you ordained in? Yeah, I don't know about that either. And he goes, well, you can't be a chaplain then. I'm like, no, that's not how the Army, like I've got this total enlisted way of thinking. It's like, that's not how the Army works. The Army works, a guy comes in, he wants to do something. It's a job that the Army has. And so the Army trains him how to do it. That's how the Army works. He goes, not for doctors, not for nurses, not for lawyers, not for chaplains. And I'm like, oh, okay. And he says, but there is a program that you can get involved in, the chaplain candidate program. And he said, if you can get yourself admitted into seminary somewhere, he said, bring back your letter of acceptance. We'll commission you as a chaplain candidate. We'll pay for your seminary. And when you graduate, we'll actually make you a chaplain. And I said, okay. So asking friends, asking people at the church, figuring out exactly what seminary was. I ultimately got enrolled in seminary, got picked up into the chaplain candidate program, and did that over the 4 years it took for me to get seminary completed, some time in a local church to meet my ministry experience requirement, and filled out a request to come back on active duty and return to the Army as a chaplain.
Okay. So a bit of a whirlwind there, for sure.
Right, yeah. Quite a change.
So I'm going to pause for a moment with moving forward with your career. So you're on the recruiting job for 6 years.
Right.
What rank are you when you're on the recruiting part?
So I was a sergeant first class, which on our scale system goes from enlisted 1, you're private with no experience, up to enlisted 9, which is your sergeant major. And so sergeant first class was enlisted 7. So the next step after my position would have been to be first sergeant for a company, and then a sergeant major for a battalion or a brigade.
Right. I just think it's crazy that they essentially lost a great soldier because they wouldn't let you leave the recruiting part of the massive military or the army part, as I say. That's just mind-blowing. You couldn't have been that good at recruiting that they wouldn't have let you go back to be a rigger.
Yeah, I was definitely upset by that.
I don't blame you.
And I'd gotten out, and I'd been out, I mean, for a real short period of time. It was just a few weeks. And a friend of mine who was a communications NCO in the 1st Special Forces group, he called me up and he says, hey, you're coming back to the field. I said, what are you talking about? And he goes, parachute riggers have just gone into shortage. So all parachute riggers are getting pulled out of recruiting duty and getting pulled out of drill sergeant duty. And I was like, wow, that would have happened 6 months ago. I'd be golden. Instead, I'm a civilian now.
Yeah, but you were still part of the reserve, so was there
no way? I was still part of the reserve. It would have been. It was possible at the time. It was theoretically possible, but I didn't know what would happen. Honestly, I was pretty scarred by recruiting duty, I have to say. People talk. When I was on recruiting duty, I was having nightmares about recruiting duty. I was suicidal when I was on recruiting duty, quite seriously. As a chaplain, that actually worked to my advantage because chaplains are responsible for the suicide awareness / prevention program in the Army. Not everywhere, but typically they are. And so I'd be able to talk with people and say, yeah, I was very close to killing myself, and telling my story. And it's like, I know how dark the pit you're in is. And so I probably could have gone into a recruiting station, processed to go from the reserve back onto active duty, and gotten a rigger assignment. It's definitely within the realm of possibility. But I was everything was so raw at the moment. I wasn't going anywhere near a recruiting station for
That's
any
fair.
reason at all.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. And if I'm doing the maths correct, when you did leave or
Right.
to become a reserve from leave active duty to become a reserve, is that 15 years?
Let's see, 85 to 2000. Yeah, we're just short of 15 years because May would be the 15-year mark. And
Wow.
I
Wow.
left active duty in, I think technically I left in March, but I had a bunch of leave saved, so I went on leave
Yeah.
so that I didn't
Okay.
have to work those last couple of months.
And then you mentioned about spending 4 years essentially going through, I'm going to call it chaplain training. Might not
Yeah,
be that, but
yeah, fair enough, fair enough.
I'm, I'm gonna give it a simple term. But you were still part of the reserve. So
Right.
did you actually continue doing reserve stuff? Like in the UK with our reserves, I think they have to like parade once a week, or I don't know what they do, but do you have to do that in the US?
When I first got off of active duty, and I was assigned to a reserve unit, and we went once a month uh, for, typically it'd be Saturday, Sunday. Occasionally it'd be Friday afternoon plus Saturday, Sunday, um, and then a couple of weeks in the summer. And I mean,
Right.
that's kind of the core description of the reserve.
So you were kind of getting your like military fix in a little way
Yeah,
because of
yeah,
that. Yeah.
and got to do the reserve unit that I was in. I'm trying to think where who I was with at the time. I was with the training unit. And so that was kind of interesting because I got certified as an Army instructor while I was there. And
Okay.
so I was able to teach classes if called upon to do so. And which ended up coming around full circle years later. So I did that until I got picked up into the chaplain candidate program. And then the chaplain candidate program, you're exempt from all the weekends, but then you have to make
Oh,
up for it in the summer.
right.
So I'd, I'd go to regular seminary coursework, fall semester, spring semester, just like going to university. But then in the summer, I would go and do 45 days somewhere. So I did
Wow.
45
Okay.
days at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. I did 45 days at Fort Hood, Texas. I did 45 days at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Did I didn't have enough free time available, and I was about to graduate, so I did 14 or 20 days somewhere in there at the Brooke Army Medical Center where our burn ward is, for because at that point the war has started and we're getting all of these wounded back, and it's still really early on, and an army who has basically been at peace for decades, with a minor skirmish here or there as an exception, is suddenly having to learn how to do trauma care again,
Mm.
because at this point all that institutional knowledge that was developed in Vietnam has all retired out and
Yeah.
is outdated, right? So the people who knew how to do
Yeah.
trauma are not in the army anymore, and what they knew how to do no longer fit modern medical technology. So I spent a few weeks there at the Brooke Army Medical Center learning how to do trauma ministry while the doctors and nurses and medics next to me were learning how to do trauma medicine, with a real steep learning curve, all while a chaplain candidate. It was a great experience. It was like getting just hit in the face with a shovel as far as how intense it was in the moment, but it was a great experience. That was um, I relied on that experience heavily once deployed in Iraq.